In 1917, an empire that had stood for 300 years didn't just fall, it completely shattered. But here's the thing, it wasn't one single event. It was two totally different revolutions happening just 8 months apart, with one paving the way for the next. So today, we're going to unravel how one of the world's great powers just completely collapsed twice in a single year.
And that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth does a country have two revolutions in less than a year? Well, it's a story about a cascade of failures, where every attempt to fix a problem just made things worse, setting the stage for an even bigger crisis down the line. Okay, so to really get why 1917 just blew up, we have to look at the pressure that had been building for years, even decades. You could say the Russian Empire was basically a powder keg of problems, and World War I, well, that was the match that finally lit the fuse. I mean, just look at this number. By the beginning of 1917, Russia had suffered over 9 million casualties in World War I. Just let that sink in. We're not just talking about a military failure here. This was a deep national trauma that absolutely broke the army's will to fight and just hollowed out the entire country.
But here's the thing, the war was really just the final straw. The empire was already simmering with all kinds of problems. Peasants were stuck in poverty, and the war effort was causing the economy to completely collapse, which led to huge food shortages in the cities. And presiding over this whole mess, Tsar Nicholas II, an autocrat who most people saw as totally incompetent and who'd basically shut down the parliament called the Duma. It was, a perfect storm just waiting to erupt.
And then, it finally happened. The first revolution, the one in February, it kind of came out of nowhere. It wasn't led by anyone. It was just a spontaneous uprising that caught everybody, even the professional revolutionaries, completely by surprise.
And wow, did things fall apart fast. It all started with women protesting because there wasn't enough bread. A couple of days later, the whole city's on strike. The Tsar orders his troops to fire, but instead they turn around and join the protesters. Just like that, in a little over a week, a dynasty that had ruled for 300 years was gone.
This is why people often call this a revolution of the streets. It wasn't led by some political party, it was driven by regular people, women waiting in bread lines, factory workers going on strike. And then, crucially, the soldiers who decided they had way more in common with the people protesting than they did with the Tsar.
Can you imagine? He's stuck on his royal train, completely cut off, and his own generals are the ones telling him it's over. So the Tsar's final act wasn't some epic battle. It was just a signature. The absolute ruler of a sixth of the world's land just signed it all the way.
But getting rid of the Tsar, well, that didn't magically fix everything. In fact, it just created this huge power vacuum. The old system was gone, sure, but nobody really knew what was supposed to replace it. And the answer was messy.
And what came next was this political nightmare called dual power. Now, this is a really crucial idea. Imagine a country with two governments at the exact same time, and both of them are constantly undermining each other. It was a recipe for total paralysis and, honestly, chaos.
So, picture this. On one side, you have the provisional government. They were the official power, but they made one huge fatal mistake. They kept Russia in the war. And on the other side, you had the Petrograd Soviet, a powerful council of workers and soldiers. They weren't the government, but they had the loyalty of the army and the streets. Yeah, this standoff was never going to last. And right into this mess steps this guy, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the radical Bolshevik party. He comes back from exile and issues his famous April Theses. And his program? It was shockingly simple and direct. End the war now, give all power to the Soviets, and deliver peace, land, and bread, which was exactly what the provisional government couldn't or wouldn't do.
So all of this sets the stage perfectly for Act Two. Because if the February Revolution was this spontaneous, chaotic uprising, the October Revolution was the complete opposite. A disciplined, carefully planned seizure of power by one single party.
And these two men were its architects. You had Lenin, who was the ideological brain and had this just uncompromising will to get power. But then you had Leon Trotsky, and he was the master organizer, the guy who actually turned the plan into a precise, military-style operation. This wasn't a riot. This was a planned, tactical operation. The Bolshevik Red Guards didn't just storm the city. They systematically took over all the key points, post offices, train stations, bridges. Then they brought in their loyal sailors and soldiers for the final move, taking the Winter Palace, where the totally helpless provisional government was just holed up waiting.
And what's really incredible is that the takeover in the capital, it was almost bloodless. The provisional government had so little support left that it basically just evaporated. The Bolsheviks immediately declared that all power now belonged to the Congress of Soviets, which, of course, was an organization they now completely controlled.
But, grabbing power in one city, that's one thing. Holding onto a whole country and trying to build a new state from the ashes of an empire, well, that's something else entirely. The real fight was just getting started.
So what did the Bolsheviks do first? They actually hold a national election for a new government. But when the results came in, they lost. So what was their response? It was swift and it was brutal. They let the new assembly meet for one single day, and then they sent in armed guards to shut it down forever. And just like that, the dream of a democratic Russia was dead. A one-party dictatorship had begun.
And that single act plunged Russia into a horrifying 5-year civil war. It was the Bolshevik Reds against a whole collection of whites who were backed by foreign countries like the US and the UK, who were terrified of communism. The cost was just staggering. Up to 10 million people died, mostly civilians from starvation and disease. But in the end, Trotsky's incredibly disciplined Red Army won. And with that brutal victory, the Bolsheviks cemented their power. In 1922, they officially created the USSR, the Soviet Union. The Russian Empire was a thing of the past, and in its place was this radical new type of state, one that would go on to shape the entire 20th century.
And this brings us right back to where we started. 2 revolutions, one exploding from the streets, the other planned in a committee room. So was the Bolshevik takeover in October the logical conclusion of the people's revolt in February, or was it the ultimate betrayal of that revolt, a triumph of the people or a coup by a minority? That's the debate that sits at the very heart of this incredible story, and it's one that historians are still arguing about today.